in a simple random sample will span a wide geographic range. And so this has some implications for the costs of conducting our survey study. Because if we were to, for example, do a simple random sample of people within the United States, we would probably have to travel to every single county in the United States in order to collect the sample from that population, because all of the people who could potentially participate in our study will be all over the United States. And it's also, simple random samples are also problematic when we're trying to understand subpopulations or subgroups, often because there may be difficulty recruiting certain subgroups, and also that some subgroups, just as a portion of the target population, are quite small relative to other groups. So if we were to just take a simple random sample of the total population and get our sample, what would happen is that we would likely see a very small number of that subgroup. But then with complex sampling designs, which we'll talk about in the next few slides, we can sort of get around this issue. So what are complex sample designs? So complex here just means that the sampling units, so the people who end up in our study, do not have an equal probability of selection. And that's one of the key assumptions of a simple random sample, is that every single person who ends up in our sample had an equal chance of getting into our sample. But in a complex sample, that's not the case. And so why is that the case? That's typically through procedures such as stratification and clustering. And so stratification can involve dividing the population into mutually exclusive strata, so strata that do not overlap. And so this could be something like age groups, it could be racial and ethnic identities, it could be gender groups, and so forth. And then you sample within each strata. So within young people aged 12 to 18, aged 18 to 25, aged 25 to 30, we're taking samples within each of those strata instead of taking a larger, just simple random sample. And then with clustering, it's a similar kind of procedure, and it can involve single or multi-stage. So there can just be one stage of clustering or a bunch of stages of clustering. But this is typically where you divide the population into clusters, usually by geography. So things like counties, neighborhoods, census tracts. And then you randomly select clusters within the overall target population to be included in your study. And then on top of this, you can also select randomly select individuals within clusters if you wanted to do so. And so why is this an issue? It's an issue because these procedures inherently violate the assumptions of a simple random sample, which are the assumptions of the common statistical tests and procedures that we do in our normal work. And so the assumptions that it violates is that there's independence of observations. So if we look at the clustering, for example, when you are looking at clusters, and say you were to cluster, our clusters would be like counties, for example, in the United States. People within one county within the United States look pretty similar to one another, especially when you compare them to another county across the United States. So the people within that one county can be pretty similar in terms of like their demographics, their political views, their health behaviors and outcomes. And we see this, particularly with like political views, we see this like in Missouri, like people in St. Louis tend to be of a more political bent, and then people in rural Missouri tend to be of a different political bent. So if we were to compare those two, the people within St. Louis region and people within like a rural Missouri region would look pretty different from one another, but they would also look really similar to one another within their community. So there's not independence of observations here. And then the second thing is that there's not equal probability selection, which I feel like I've now said like 12 times, but that's the most important thing here. So if we were to do stratification, for example, and we wanted to oversample like young people, so young people are oversampled and then have a much higher likelihood of or probability of ending up in our sample compared to say older adults. So there are sort of a lot of things going on here that just violate some of the assumptions that we use in a lot of our traditional statistics procedures. Next slide. And then so why are we using these sample designs beyond the reasons that we just said earlier? So the main thing is just reducing costs. This is primarily through travel and interviewer costs, especially when we're doing household surveys. So when you do a household survey, you have to go out to the household and knock on doors. So you have to physically go to that place. And that involves a lot of money being spent on interviewer travel and interviewer wages for their time. Another reason that we consider using complex sample designs is to improve precision for the overall group and subgroups, whether this is like a subgroup that you're interested in. So it could be like young people, Black people, lower income people. Generally, we will be able to get better, smaller confidence intervals and standard errors when we use a complex sample design through things like stratification and clustering. And then also, just to go off of that point, we have the chance to improve statistical efficiency over a simple random sample through variance estimation, which I think I'll walk through on the next slide. Nope, not the next slide. A few more slides. This is sort of this is a map of the United States. And here I'm trying to walk through sort of what a multi-stage cluster sampling design would look like in the United States, using households as our ultimate, our final sampling unit. So say that we wanted to gather, 50,000 people in our sample across the United States. And if we did a simple random sample, we could expect that to see that the distance between each sample person would probably be quite large. And so it would involve, again, a lot of travel costs and interviewer time through wages. And there are about 3,000 counties within the United States. So if we have 50,000 people in our sample, we could feasibly have people sampled in every single county in the United States. So we'd have to travel to every single one, which would cost a lot of money. And so instead of doing that, we could do what's called a multi-stage clustered sampling design. And so our primary sampling unit here that we're using are counties in the United States. And so we can select those larger units like counties and then select smaller units like census tracts and households within those counties. And so this is ultimately reduces the amount of travel time and interviewer related costs. But then the overall probability of selection for each unit is also impacted by each of these sampling stages. So let's, for example, say that one of the counties that we sampled is this one in Wisconsin. And then within that county, there are a certain number of census tracts. And so we've randomly sampled the county. And then within that, we are randomly sampling a census tract. And then within that census tract, we are randomly sampling a household to participate in our survey. And so typically within the census tract level, we'll sort of sample a few different households so that we're able to get a larger number of people within each sampled cluster. And so that's the way that we're able to sort of reduce that travel time because all of those sampled households will be near each other. And so if we think about this theoretically, like a household that lives in a county that was not sampled at that first primary sampling stage, which is the county, they have a much lower probability of selection of actually ending up into our sample. But in theory, everyone within the sampling frame, and our sampling frame here is the United States, everyone has a non-zero probability of being selected. But it's just that the cluster sampling causes some households to have a very low probability of selection and some to have a much higher probability of selection. So that's where we get that unequal selection probability. And then to speak a little bit more about stratified sampling. So our primary purpose here is just to generate more efficient variance estimates. And so this can look like our tighter, standard errors and tighter confidence intervals, which we want, because then we are able to have more confidence in the results that we get and in the inferences that we make. And stratified sampling can also be combined with something called oversampling or undersampling. And that can be used to ensure sufficient sample sizes of population subgroups. So if we had a population subgroup that we are particularly interested in studying, and we want to make sure that we have enough of them in our sample so that we can make proper inferences for them, we could oversample that group. And what we would do is basically we could divide up our population into strata and then sample within the strata and we could oversample relative to their population percentage. So that there would be more people in the sample of that, demographic characteristic or geographic region relative to their actual population distribution. Let's see. And then on this next slide, I'm going to walk through a quick example. There are going to be equations here. Don't freak out. we will walk through them slowly. But I wanted to sort of show you what this looks like from a variance estimation point of view when we have stratified sampling and what that does for the design effect and the effective sample size. So here I've devised a hypothetical population with a population size of 1 million people. And it has an associated variance and mean. And these are not things that we are directly observing. These are just hypothetical. So this is like a hypothetical variance and mean for this population. And then this population could be stratified into two different groups, urban and rural. And these urban group makes up about 20% of this total population, and the rural group makes up about 80% of the population. And you see that those also have an associated population level variance and means. And so to illustrate the point here, let's say that we wanted to take a simple random sample of 1,200 participants within this total population. So we're just looking at the first column. We're not looking at stratum 1, stratum 2. The way that we would calculate our variance here under the assumption of simple random sample is we would take our variance, which is 1,800,000, divided by the sample size to get 1,500. But under stratified sampling, our calculations will be a little bit different because there's different things going on that lead to our variance calculation. So let's say we still had that same total sample size of 1,200 participants, and then instead of taking a simple random sample of the entire population, we instead did stratified sampling. So we took an equal portion of each strata. So 240 is 20% of 1,200, and 960 is 80% of 1,200. But our calculation here changes a little bit because the equation changes. So here we have, instead of just the variance divided by the sample size, we have the variance times the weight divided by the sample size for each strata. And the weight is just the proportion of the population. And this is how it's calculated. So this is the variance calculation under the assumption of stratified sampling. And what we get is a variance calculation of 1,333. And so we can use this information to show the differences in the variance estimation between simple random samples and stratified sampling. And so what we can calculate now is what's called a design effect. So a design effect is just the quotient of the variance from the stratified sample divided by the variance from the simple random sample. And so here, what this tells us, we're doing 1,333 divided by 1,500 to get a design effect estimate of 0.89. And so what that tells us is that the variance from the stratified sample in this hypothetical situation is 0.89 times that of the simple random sample. And this indicates that the stratified sample design is more efficient from a variance estimation point of view. So in general, a design effect of less than 1 means that the design or this complex sample design is more efficient than the simple random sample, while a design effect of greater than 1 means that the simple random sample is more efficient. And we can also show this by our effective sample size. So our effective sample size basically tells us that if we were to do a simple random sample, what is the necessary sample size to achieve the same level of precision or variance as the given complex sample design? So we take our sample size of 1,200, and then we divide that by our design effect. And what we get is 1,348. And so what that means is that we have an effective sample size of 1,348 under the simple random sample, meaning that we would need an additional 148 survey respondents to have the same lower level of variance that we got with the stratified sample. And again, we're always looking for lower variance, tighter confidence intervals, tighter standard errors, because we want to have more precision about what we're doing. So what that means is that the stratified sample here in this example has greater precision relative to the simple random sample. Yes, and it's $8. Thanks, Kim. Yeah, so this this design, so now we don't have to pay 148 additional participants. So that's another good reason for using complex sample designs. And then here, just going to walk through a little bit more about stratified sampling and what that looks like. So say that we wanted to take a sample of 25,000 participants from the United States. I've included here, and so I've included here the racial and ethnic breakdown of the United States using census data. And so we see here, obviously, that the racial and ethnic breakdown in the United States is not equal across groups. Duh. And so if we were to take a simple random sample with our 25,000 sample size target, we would see this general breakdown here, if assuming again that everyone had an equal probability of selection, which, you know, does everyone have an equal probability of selection? Probably not, but we're just assuming that everyone has an equal probability of selection, and this is sort of the sample that we end up with. And so why is that an issue? It's an issue because if we wanted to make inferences about, say, the Native Hawaiian group, which make up 0.2% of the population, we would only have 50 people in our subgroup. So 50 people is not really enough to make a lot of you know, estimates and inferences about what's going on with the Native Hawaiian population. And so if we, as researchers, were particularly interested in, you know, what are the specific health issues and health factors going on in Native Hawaiian communities, we would want to do some sort of stratified sampling in order to get a larger number, a larger N of Native Hawaiian people into our sample. And so what we could then do is then split up our sample design into different strata. And then we could take within each racial and ethnic group, we could take a certain number, a predefined number of people, and then have that be our sample size within each group. And then what we'll talk about later is, like, when we're analyzing this, then we can use these unequal probabilities of selection. So obviously, Native Hawaiian people relative to their population proportion are much more likely to be included in our sample relative to the simple random sample. So we would use calculations that our SAS, Theta, and R will do for us to sort of bring this stratified sample back to the population. So that's another reason why we have to use special procedures whenever we're analyzing this type of data. Let's see. So now I'm going to talk through just some common variables that are used in design-based analysis. And we'll go into these more in depth later on in the presentation, but I just wanted to introduce them here. The first one is the strata variable. Again, this is just the mutually exclusive population subgroups that are included in our sample. And so typically the strata group is like the geographic region or the group of people by demographics. And there can be multiple sort of stratification stages within some surveys. So we'll talk about the National Survey on Drug Use and Health later, which first stratifies by geographic regions within states, and then it implicitly stratifies by racial, ethnic, income, and age group by making unequal probabilities of selection once they've gotten through that first strata. So it's a little, that's all you need to know, though, is that it's just like the groups that we're sampling from. And then we have what's called our primary sampling units, or PSUs. So this is, as the name implies, the first unit that is sampled in the design. And this is typically occurring like after some kind of stratification. So in the example of NISDA, this could be we stratify by certain regions, and then within each region, we randomly select something. So the primary sampling unit is the first thing that we randomly select. And then finally, we'll also have some sampling or final weights, also called analysis weights. These are, you don't really need to know how these are calculated. It's very complicated. I tried to read through this like 200 word document about how NISDA data is, like the weights are, it's just very complicated, but you don't need to know it because luckily the CDC and National Center for Health Statistics, they do this work for you. So then all you have to do is just include that weight variable in your analysis. But to understand a little bit on the background here, the sampling weights are the inverse of the probability of being included in the sample given the sample design. So it takes into account all of those stages of selection that occur and estimates based on those stages of selection what was the probability of being selected. And then this is just used to weight the sample back to the original population of interest. So when we go through all of this stratification and clustering, we're ending up with a sample that really actually doesn't look like our target population. And so we have to readjust whenever we are doing our analysis to convert it back to the population. And then again, this accounts for unequal probability of selection, unit non-response, and sampling frame errors. And so I'm going to walk through just a brief example here of a hypothetical, if we were to do a survey of Missouri resident households. And we first wanted to we say we had our strata were regions of Missouri. So we split Missouri into St. Louis region, Kansas City region, and then just the rest of Missouri. And so within our strata, and so here at the strata level, we're not randomly sampling. It's at the next level, which is the primary sampling unit that we're randomly sampling. So within the St. Louis region, within the Kansas City region, within the rest of Missouri, we're randomly sampling census tracts, for example. And then within each census tract, we could randomly sample households. And sometimes this is called the secondary sampling unit. And then we could even go even further and have a third sampling unit, which would be like individuals within households. So we could just keep going and going and going like that. But again, our primary sampling unit is just the first one that we have randomly sampled in our survey design. Okay, before we go further, are there any quick questions? Feel free to come off mute or put them in the chat. Just wanted to pause for a second. So that was a lot of information. Okay, I will move forward. So now we're going to do a guided tutorial of analysis in the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, or NISDA, is operated through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And its primary aim is to describe population trends and correlates of tobacco, alcohol, and drug use, as well as mental health concerns and other health-related issues in the United States. And then the data from NISDA is complex sample design, and it's an annual cross-sectional study. So each year we get a different sample of people who participate in NISDA. And then here is, I'm gonna walk you through this table. Don't get too scared. So here is sort of the breakdown of like the sampling units within the strata and the sampling units within the NISDA sampling design. And this was honestly the easiest one I could find to show this. So, so you see first that NISDA is a state stratified multi-stage cluster design. And so we see that here because the states are geographically partitioned into what's called state sampling regions, or SSRs. And so, hold on, come on. Okay, so the SSRs are these equal size population regions within each state that are made up of census tracts. And these census tracts, in terms of their population, are relatively equal comparing the SSRs. And so you see here that, oh, gosh, my cat is like playing with something and it's loud. So you see that the states at the top, so you see that California is the largest state. It gets 36 state sampling regions. So that means that the state of California is geographically, yes, cat emoji. The state is geographically divided into 36 state sampling regions. And then the segments are the census blocks. So this is the smallest unit before you get to the households. And so there are 288 segments with, oh my gosh, there are 288 segments that are sampled within California. And then there are a total of 4,560 respondents that are sampled within California. And so the primary reason that it's done in the state stratified way is so that state mental health agencies can generate state representative data to describe trends within their own state, because each state obviously has different sort of contexts going on. And then you see, here at the bottom, when you see total per SSR, that's per state sampling region. You'll see that the respondents per segment that we end up sampling are about 15 people. So what's it trying to say? So like, for example, when we sample the census block, we're going to get about 15 people within that census block who will participate in our survey. And the numbers get smaller as the states get smaller. And then respondents here means the individuals who within households that are selected to participate. And larger states, as I've explained, get more SSRs, more segments, and more respondents. And so to sort of hammer this concept, I'm going to walk through the NSDA sample design specifically in Missouri, since it is a state stratified sample. So the state of Missouri is split up into 12 state regions. And you'll see here that they generally, map up with the population distribution of Missouri. So there are smaller ones in the St. Louis and Kansas City region and larger ones everywhere else. And so say that we were interested in looking specifically at state sampling region number 3, which is generally approximately the St. Louis City area. And so here we're going to want to sample within this state sampling region. We're going to select a census tract. And so here we've selected census tract 1052, which happens to be the neighborhood that I live in, which is why I chose it. And then within the census tract, we're going to select a census block group. And so within this block group, there are 2 groups. There's block group 1 and block group 2 of census tract 1052 within state sampling region 03 of Missouri. And then here we're just going to choose block 1. And within this block, you'll see that there are, I think, about 18 census blocks. And then from those, we're going to randomly sample 8 of those census blocks. And then within those census blocks, we're going to randomly sample households. So that's sort of how we get from national all the way down to the smallest units. And then I just want to walk through some key steps for analyzing NSDA data and other data that comes from a complex sampling survey design. So the key thing here is to read the data documentation. So every complex sample data source, particularly from like government sources, you come across will have some kind of data documentation or sample design report or statistical inference report. They're all called like different things. Some of them have different chapters for each thing that you need, but it describes the sample design and the variables that you need in great detail. And so these will be a great resource for understanding how the data was collected. And it often, provides sample code that you can use in statistical packages. So it's a great resource. And I've linked, and I can link you some, I think there are some linked in the R Markdown that I have created for this workshop. And so after understanding our data source and understanding how our variables came to be and how our participants came to be, we then load and install any necessary packages to run a complex sample survey analysis. So in R, this is the survey package. I think there are a few others, but this is the most common one that's used. Whereas in Stata and in SAS, these survey procedures and survey packages are automatically included in those programs, so you don't need to do any additional installation. And then after you've loaded your packages, you read your data into the statistics program. And then for R and for Stata, you can use certain commands to basically inform the statistical program about the different survey design elements. So the strata weights, the cluster weights, and the sampling or final weights. That basically tells R and Stata that you are using a complex sample survey, and then here is how you should calculate the variance and the mean estimates based on this information. And so you have to do that first before you run any analysis in Stata and R. And then if necessary, you can identify what's called a subpopulation to run what's called an unconditional analysis. And I'll walk through that, I think, in the next slide. And then here are just like some examples of like using appropriate commands to analyze complex sample data in R, Stata, and SAS, which you can review later. But generally, you just add sort of the survey prefix to whatever you're trying to do. And now I also want to go over like, why do we want to identify a subpopulation? So oftentimes as researchers, we are wanting to make inferences about a specific group, whether that's like young LGBTQ people or Hispanic adolescent women, or like we're wanting to make inferences about a specific group. And then also, whenever we have these big data sets, we most often do not have complete data for every single participant who was involved in the study. And so we have to sort of take that missing data and the specific group that we're looking at into account. And typically, whenever we have data that we assume come from a simple random sample or a convenience sample even, we just drop participants who have missing data, or drop participants who do not meet the qualifications for our specific subpopulation of interest. But we do not want to do that in complex sample analysis. You should never drop participants or observations. And so why is that? This is because the statistical program that you're using can't process all of the possible design elements whenever you delete people, because each person has attached to them a strata, PSU, and a sampling weight that has to be included to calculate accurate variance estimates. And so it requires full design information in order to calculate those. And so what happens is that when you don't identify a subpopulation within your overall data set, you will get incorrect standard errors and confidence intervals. And then this could lead you down the road of incorrect inferences, because we could have, for example, a result that was statistically significant when we didn't account for the subpopulation and all of the variance estimation going on. We could have that significant result become insignificant. Oh, and now my cat is playing with my camera. He really does not want to leave me alone. Okay, but basically, bad idea, no, do not ever drop participants when you're doing complex sample analysis. And here she is, okay. Oh my God. And so here we're just gonna run back through the key variables that you need to use and be aware of when you're running a design-based analysis. Again, the data documentation will have will direct you in the right path to finding these, but you just need to know kind of what to look for. And so primarily we're concerned with our strata weights and primary sampling units, and in our sampling weights. And so in NISDA, these correspond to these variable names. And again, just read the data documentation and you can find this out. Let's see. Oh, and then the good thing is that most complex sample surveys do all the design and weighting calculations for you, and they just put these in these variables. And so you don't have to do any additional calculation beyond just including these variables in your analysis. Another common thing in research is combining multiple waves of a complex sample data source. So For example, if you were to do a trends analysis from say 2010 to 2020, or if you were wanting to study a group that has generally a low sample size in the data set for 1 year. So in my research, for example, I often combine multiple waves to study LGBTQ people because the proportion of people within the sample who identify as like a sexual and gender minority is typically like, 3 to 6% of the data set. And so that ends up being like only like maybe 100 or 200 people within the data set. And you can't really make much of an inference off of that small of a sample size, especially when you want to stratify by other kind of variables. And so that's sort of like the rationale behind combining multiple waves, and it's a great thing to do. I do it all the time. But the only thing you have to do is just a simple calculation before you actually run your analysis. And so that is just adjusting that sampling or person level weights prior to analysis. And all you have to do is just divide the weight variable by the number of waves that were included. So if we look at an example where we wanted to analyze 5 waves of NSDA data from 2015 to 2019, again, it's collected annually, so there are 5 years there. All you have to do is just divide the analysis or sampling or person level weight by 5. And then here's just some examples of how to do that in R, Stata, and SAS. Okay, and now I'm going to walk through a few best practices for analyzing NSDA data in R, and this can be translated to other complex sample survey designs, but we're just using this as like a example so we can see how it applies across different packages. So the first thing that you want to do is to generate the overall survey design object. And so this is within the survey package that I talked about earlier. So you first have to install that library, install the package of the survey package, and then you can run the survey design function or command, and then you save that into what's an object called NSDA_design or whatever you want to call it. And basically the ID variable is the PSU, the strata is the strata, and then the weights are the sampling weights or the final weights. And then we also say nest equals true. This is for NSDA specifically because it nests the clusters within the strata. But again, you would just want to look at the data documentation for the specific data source that you were trying to analyze. And that honestly, like most of them will have this sort of like sample code written out for you. So you could just use that as a resource, but this is specifically for NSDA. And then also, if needed, you can identify a subpopulation that you're trying to study. So if you were interested in studying a health outcome specifically among Hispanic females, you could create a subpopulation variable, which I just called SP right here, and saying that SP equals 1 when Hispanic equals 1 and female equals 1. And if it does not meet that criteria, it equals 0. So then all we have to do when we want to run our design-based analysis, we can generate a subpopulation survey design object just by subsetting this design object that we did over here, and then saying that we want to subset it when SP equals 1. And so that is the sort of general way of doing that. You could also, since, sometimes your subpopulation will be very complex and it'll involve like 20 different variables that you're interested in. But sometimes it'll just be like 2 variables like this. So you could also alternatively, instead of making a subpopulation variable, you could just say subset NSDA_design, comma, Hispanic equals 1 and female equals 1. So that would have the same sort of impact on our, let's see. Oh, sorry, I'm just looking at the chat. I'm actually not sure about missing data imputation. That is beyond the scope of my knowledge at this point. But I could probably try to put together some resources and share them with everyone after.
Hunter, I can say I worked with the people who do the BRFSS weighting, and they do a hot deck imputation for missing data so that all the weights can be used. And I don't know if they use this strategy for the big data set, but we were following similar methodology for a St. Louis survey. So it's a problem because the weights don't, if you have missing data and observations are excluded, the weights aren't correct anymore.
Yeah, so that's why it's important to do the like the subpopulation analysis, because that makes sure that the data frame or the analysis procedure that you're using will take into account the missing data and the data that does not end up in your population, your subpopulation. So it'll still collect all of that, like from the Vector variable, the VREP data variable, and the adjusted weight variable. It'll collect all that information from those variables, but it will only use the subpopulation to calculate, for example, your mean estimates and your proportion estimates. So that's sort of like how that's handled to my knowledge, but it could be different across different different data sources. So not sure I understand the question, Janine.
I think you're actually going over it right now, so I'm gonna let you keep going. And I'll just announce that I put some instructions for what you're doing. I put a link to that in the chat in case anybody is having trouble writing all this down.
Yeah. So I'm making everything publicly available. So it'll be on my GitHub account. So I'll put these slides up. I'll put and then the R code, which we'll run through in a little bit, and the data set will also be all up there. So, and I'll explain how you download that for anyone who's interested in doing this further. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Stata, which is a little less, it's a little more simple. And so what you do here is that you have to first, like in R, you have to inform Stata of the design elements. And so how we do that here is with the SBY set command, which is automatically included, I believe, in Stata. I don't think I've ever had to download the survey package, but so basically you just set it up to where you just set up your data, where you have the VREP, which is the PSU variable, the PW equals the person level weights, or the final weights or sampling weights, whatever you want to call them. And then the strata is the Vector variable. And then the only thing that's different here, this is for NISDA specifically, you have to include this degrees of freedom in Stata. And so what this does, what this means is that there are the number of state sampling regions within the NISDA data set are 750 per year in this 2015 to 2019 data. You don't have to add them together because the 2015 to 2019 all had the same degrees of freedom, so you can just use 750. But if you're combining waves with unequal state sampling regions, so say, I think it's pre-2014 or pre-2013, the state sampling regions within NISDA were, I think, 900. And so what you would have to do is use the lower amount of the two for a more conservative analysis. So you would use 750 if we were to do like a trends analysis from like 2010 to 2019. And then analysis in Stata is pretty simple. All you have to do is add this SBY colon right before your commands. So you can use your normal commands like means, tab, reg, logistic, and so forth. And doesn't really change much. All you have to do is just put that SBY in the front, and that just tells Stata, I am analyzing data from a complex sample. And then if needed, similar to R, you can identify your subpopulation with just an additional command called subpop, and then within the parentheses, you would put your subpop variable. So you would just have SBY, comma, subpop variable. And then you could, I didn't put instructions for how to generate the subpop variable here, but it's basically just like generating a variable in Stata. So as if you're in Stata, you should know how to generate a variable. That's what I'm assuming that you know how to do. And then at the bottom, there are, and this is on the other page too, there's additional Stata resources from the UCLA Statistics Department, which just has like amazing resources for doing this kind of analysis, and really any kind of analysis. I go there all the time and would highly recommend it. But they have guided tutorials on how to do this kind of analysis in different packages. Okay. Yeah, so I think NISDA and all these national, they have like a whole team of people who are just doing like weighting. And so they handle it all themselves. And if you go and read like how they actually calculate these weights, it's like bananas. Like it's so many things that go into it that you could never possibly try to teach someone. So yeah, so yes, great. I think that's what I was talking about. So it's they handle it for you, but if you were to say like do a complex sample design on your own, then you would sort of have to figure that out. Did I answer that question, Pam?
No, that's perfect. That's why, yeah, I have to read the documentation. It's quite long.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, each of these, they're like chapters for NISDA, and there's like, I think like 15 chapters, and each of them are like 200 pages long. It's just outrageous. So that's the purpose of this presentation, to give you the brief overview. Okay, so then we're going to move on to SAS. SAS is a little different from Stata and R because there's no survey object and there's no like SDY set procedure that you have to do before. So it's a little clunkier because then you have to identify the design elements with each procedure that you run. And so here, if we were to do survey weighted means, so we would use proc survey means instead of like the traditional proc means. Basically the survey commands in SAS just have this like survey prefix on them. And so then we use, we identify our weight variable, which is our person or analysis level weight, our cluster variable, a strata variable. And then the domain, if necessary, we would just like include our subpopulation variable, and then we would have our variable list that we're trying to analyze. And then this is what it would look like in the context of NISDA. Again, you would have your weights being the adjusted weight 5, cluster being the VREP or the PSUs, and then strata being the vector variable, and then domain equaling SP. And then here you don't need to include any Boolean logic, so you don't have to have like SP equals 1. You just put SP, and then you have your variables. And then again, the common SAS survey procedures are survey freak, survey means, survey reg, survey logistic. They're just basically adding that survey prefix to the other command. It's not as like flexible, I would say. I would not recommend SAS for analyzing this kind of data. I would recommend using something more like Stata or R, just because they're a little more flexible in like analyzing and like being able to sort of like look at different things, because there's a limited number of these like survey commands. And again, here at the bottom is another resource from the UCLA Statistics Department. Okay, well, we have, I think about like what, 4 minutes left, so we might not get through this tutorial, but I am going to drop this zip file in the chat so that you can go to it, and it's also linked on my GitHub. So basically, if you click this, it'll download everything for you. But I think I'm just going to stop there and just ask for any questions, anything on your mind that I can maybe help with.
Hunter, they can make appointments with you to go through the tutorial.
Yes. Yeah.
It actually is really good though. I went through it last night, so it's pretty self-guided.
Mm-hmm. So I see, okay, so is there a difference between the survey package in R to ID clusters and specifying mixed effects via clusters to LMER? Yeah, I'm not as familiar with like multi-level models and complex sample data, so that's outside of my domain, unfortunately, but I could try to find some resources for you.
Hunter, that could be part 2. Maybe next fall.
Multi-level analysis of complex samples. Yeah.
Multi-level, yeah.
Any other questions?
I think people are starting to hop off, and before they all do, I just want to have everybody join me in thanking Hunter for his time and expertise and all the great information that I'm sure will be useful to so many of you. So, and me as well. So, so thank you for all the resources and knowledge.
No problem. I'm glad to help.
we'll be having another one, but everybody's leaving now. So.
Yeah, we have another one coming up in March. It should be on your calendars.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, John Francois.
Hey,
Hi,
I'll
Jamie.
still stay a minute. Hi. Haven't seen you in a while.
I know.
I mean,
yeah,
I saw you, like I saw your picture, but not you.
yeah, I was trying to eat between meetings while listening to Hunter. It's really great. Thanks so much for this update. I've been using a lot I only do primary data collection, so I needed an update, and I've been using Stata with the same command you suggested. But as Kim knows, I'm trying to move to R, and so that was a great way.
Well, yeah, you forget about how to do stuff in other software once you fully transition. I have. My SAS is so rusty, and I did like 10 years of SAS.
Yeah. And it's, yeah.
Well, anyway, Hunter, great job.
Yeah, fantastic.
I missed your cat. I didn't get to see your cat. I didn't know
I did.